Okay, so I've basically printed the photograph of my face into a few different colors. Now, it doesn't matter what color the image is that you're painting or what color you're painting it in, because I've painted purple faces, red faces, green faces. What matters is tone, so how light or dark things are. So in order to get a really good painting, one needs shape training and tone training. And you need to be able to see how dark is dark and how light is light. So that's why I often, especially for beginners, it's good to work from a black and white image so that you can start to train your mind to see how dark is dark and how light is light. Also, another thing, I keep a little booklet like this, which I cut a hole in the page like this. So when I want to match my paint to the image, in those cases in this case my paint's yellow, but you know, you can't really see what color this is. To me, when I look at it, it looks yellow, but when I actually put my paint next to the image on the page, of course it's a completely different color. So what I've ended up deciding to do is I'm going to use a different color from the colors on the picture, but of course I'm going to use the same tone, so the same variation of light and dark. I'm going to start by dry brushing some of the highlights onto my painting and then dry brushing some of the shadows. So dry brushing is when you use very, very dry, no terps paint, and you very, very thinly brush some of the highlights and shadow areas onto your image.
So you're just using the white at the moment?
Well, it's white with a dash of yellow in this case. So just dry brushing these shapes, the lighter shapes. As you can see, I'm just dry brushing some of the very basic shapes in here. Still in my mind, I'm seeing the image as puzzle pieces and how each puzzle piece locks into the next puzzle piece. Is just to remind you that there are two palettes, mixing palettes. The one palette, of course, is here, where you mix your paint. The other palette is here. So I do a lot of mixing on the actual painting because it's sometimes very difficult to see what the paint is doing when it's on this palette and surrounded in this case by white. As soon as you put it on here, the color changes because it's surrounded by different coloring. So just keep that in mind. You can make paint darker or lighter and change the color on your actual painting. So just with regards to brushes, you get brushes that push paint and they are generally firm, and then you get brushes that pull paint, which are generally watercolor brushes, are used for watercolor. But in watercolor and oil paint we use both brushes. So with watercolor paintings, for example, you still use oil painting brushes because sometimes you want to push paint. Also with dry brushing, one tends to push paint with the dry thin paint that we're using here on the top. And then when we are doing lines and sharp detail, we use far more watery terpsed down paint, and for that we use the brushes that pull paint. So this paint that I'm putting on the top, again, just to remind you, it's very dry, so it's very little paint spread out, because of course you've got your solid paint underneath. Therefore the paint on the top can be quite thinly applied. Okay, so the grid method we used for drawing was, again, just to give you a very, very basic drawing. Now we're going to try and move everything into the right place. There's already something not quite right. When I look at this puzzle piece here between the shadow beside the nose and the eye, it's a little bit shorter or smaller. This puzzle piece here is wider. So we're going to move the nose to correct this. Basically, we continuously shift the features now until they are in the right place. It is easier to put something down and then move it around into the right place rather than trying to get everything correct straight off the bat. It is a little bit more of an organic process, but also gives you a lot of leverage to eventually get things into the right place. And that's also why we leave things initially so vague, so that we can move everything into the right place before we start to add detail. I say to my students, a painting is one big mistake till the end of the painting. And with this process, as I said, you shift things around. So don't think of things in terms of mistakes. It's the process to redo and reshape until you're happy with it. Okay, so as you can see, I've just put down some of the basic shapes. Remembering, again, thin paint on top of your solid paint. And then one shape basically tells you about the next shape, which tells you about the next shape. Yeah, so just painting some of the shadows in now. Once you've done with placement, you can then go into detail. As you can see, everything's been moved around. You know, the nose has been moved around, the mouth's been moved around, chin's been moved around. That's how this process always works. We move things around until we're happy that they're in the right place. Sometimes it's a good idea to turn your canvas around in a few different ways so that you can have a different view of the shapes, and therefore you can see things you hadn't seen before when the canvas was turned a certain way. So before you finalize the placement of your features by adding more detail and blending, it's a good idea to look at your painting in the mirror, which is a classic tool used by artists. When you look at the painting in the mirror, you can often see if something is crooked or in the wrong place straight away. Okay, so I've just softened the edges, so I can either add detail and definition now, because the paint that I've used is not very thick. If the paints were too thick, I wouldn't be able to add detail now. Alternatively, I can let it dry and then add detail and definition when it's dry.
Yeah.